The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, by Iain McGilchrist. Volume 1, The Ways to Truth. Epigraph from Wilder Penfield. The problem of neurology is to understand man himself. From Plotinus. But we, who are we? Introduction. Epigraph from Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yes, a key can lie forever in the place where the locksmith left it, and never be used to open the lock the master forged it for. This book is an attempt to convey a way of looking at the world quite different from the one that has largely dominated the West for at least 350 years. Some would say as long as 2,000 years. I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality and chosen to ignore or silence the minority of voices that have intuited as much and consistently maintained that this is the case. Now we have reached the point where there is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves. Attempting to convey such a richer insight is the ambition of this book. We have been seriously misled, I believe, because we have depended on that aspect of our brains that is most adept at manipulating the world in order to bend it to our purposes. The brain is, importantly, divided into two hemispheres. You could say, to sum up a vastly complex matter in a phrase, that the brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend and thus manipulate the world, the right hemisphere to comprehend it, to see it all for what it is. The problem is that the very brain mechanisms which succeed in simplifying the world so as to subject it to our control militate against a true understanding of it. Meanwhile, compounding the problem, we take the success we have in manipulating it as proof that we understand it. But that is a logical error. To exert power over something requires us only to know what happens when we pull the levers, press the button, or utter the spell. The fallacy is memorialized in the myth of the sorcerer's apprentice. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that while we have succeeded in coercing the world to our will to an extent unimaginable even a few generations ago, we have at the same time wrought havoc on that world precisely because we have not understood it. This book, then, is about the nature of reality. It's about how we are equipped by our brains to try to understand it, and what we can learn from that. It's about the approaches that are available to us to gain an understanding of reality, given that equipment. It attempts, consequently, to give an account of reality that seems truer to the evidence than the one to which we have long been accustomed, one that is far-reaching in its scope and consistent across the realms of contemporary neurology, philosophy, and physics. And from that follows an account of who we are, on which nothing less than our future depends. What in particular I offer here is a new synthesis of philosophy and science, which I believe is importantly and excitingly liberating to both parties. As a rule, philosophy and science go on as if the other did not exist. Scientists tend to see philosophy as a luxury they can't afford to get involved with, a ball and chain that will slow them down in their race for the next discovery. Philosophers to see science as somewhat beneath them, and in any case irrelevant to the ponderings of the mind on itself. But, as the great physicist Erwin Schrödinger put it in Science and Humanism, it seems plain and self-evident, yet it needs to be said. The isolated knowledge obtained by a group of specialists in a narrow field has in itself no value whatsoever, but only in its synthesis with all the rest of knowledge, and only inasmuch as it really contributes in this synthesis toward answering the demand, Tines de hemais, who are we? Here Schrödinger is remembering Plotinus, one of the greatest Greek philosophers, but his point is of a contemporary relevance that it is impossible to overstate. 70 years on from Schrödinger's pronouncement, specialization makes it even harder to expect more than a tiny handful of scientists and philosophers to be in a position to venture into a genuinely new understanding of their, in reality, common enterprise, one that has the potential hugely to enrich both parties. When any attempt is made to reach out a hand across the distancing void, it is almost invariably an exercise in reinforcing the status quo, the scientists telling the philosophers that they find only machinery, and the philosophers reflecting back to the scientists that a mechanistic view is the best option on offer. Since what you find is a product of how you attend, this is a more or less pointless exercise in making sure that both parties sink to the bottom in the shortest possible time. Philosophy is engaged in weighing evidence so as to decide between conflicting ways of understanding the world, each of which has something to be said for it. This is why philosophy never ends. But what if, among the evidence, there was some way of recognizing a particular take on the world as not just floating in a contextual void, but rather the predictable result of paying a quite particular kind of attention to the world? And what if we happen to know a great deal about the evolutionary purposes and the consequences of such a way of attending, including what weight we should attach to its findings? And what if such insights gained from science and explicated by philosophy could be applied in turn to the science of mind itself? Then might we not begin to see a fertile symbiosis of philosophy and science helping one another, each turn building on the next, to rise to a new, more truthful vision of who indeed we are? Rethinking some assumptions. At the core of the contemporary world is the reductionist view that we are, nature is, the earth is, nothing but a bundle of senseless particles, pointlessly, helplessly, mindlessly colliding in a predictable fashion, whose existence is purely material and whose only value is utility. Neither Plotinus nor Schrödinger would have been impressed. I cannot remember a time when I thought this sounded at all convincing, and a lifetime's thinking and learning has done nothing to allay my scepticism. Not only is it mistaken, I believe, but actively damaging, physically to the natural world, and psychologically, morally, and spiritually to ourselves as part of that world. It endangers everything that we should value. Reductionism can mean a number of things, but here I mean, quite simply, the outlook that assumes that the only way to understand the nature of anything we experience is by looking at the parts of which it appears to be made, and building up from there. By contrast, I believe that the whole is never the same as the sum of its parts, and that, except in the case of machines, there are in fact no parts as such, but that they are an artifact of a certain way of looking at the world. For this reason, it is every bit as true that what we call the parts can be understood only by understanding the whole to which they belong. And with the reductionist outlook goes determinism, the belief that if we knew enough about the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, we could predict everything that happens from here on in, including your every thought, desire, and belief. Even if contemporary physics did not demonstrate that this is an impossibility, there is a problem with this kind of argument. Reductionists and determinists unerringly fail to take account of the fact that their own arguments apply to themselves. If my beliefs are nothing but the mechanical products of a blind system, so are all views, including those of the reductionist. If everything is already determined, the determinist's tendency to embrace determinism is also merely determined, and we have no reason to take it seriously, since we are all determined either to believe it or not already. As the philosopher Hans Jonas observed, there is an unspoken hierarchical principle involved. The scientist does take man to be determined by causal laws, but not himself while he assumes and exercises his freedom of inquiry and his openness to reason, evidence, and truth. His own working assumptions involve free will, deliberation, and evaluation as aspects of himself, but these qualities and capacities are stripped away from and denied to the human object or thing that he is inspecting. If it were not for the fact that this world picture is mistaken, you might argue that we ought nonetheless to man up and accept it. But it is, as I hope to demonstrate, massively mistaken. My aim is to show the reader the magnitude of the error and its consequences. I say show, because I cannot any more than anyone else prove anything finally and irrefutably. The material with which we are dealing makes that impossible. But rather I wish to take my reader by degrees to a new vantage point, one built upon science and philosophy, from which in all likelihood the view will appear at the same time unfamiliar and yet in no way alien, indeed rather the opposite, more like a homecoming. From there the reader must, of course, make up his mind for himself. To put the matter in a nutshell, wrote the philosopher Friedrich Waismann, a philosophical argument does more and does less than a logical one. Less in that it never establishes anything conclusively, more in that if successful, it is not content to establish just one isolated point of truth, but effects a change in our whole mental outlook, so that as a result of that, myriads of such little points are brought into view or turned out of sight, as the case may be. Such a whole shift of view, rather than the adjustment of a few points within a familiar landscape, is what I hope for my reader. And that process must begin with the very idea of things. The world is not just a set of separately existing localized objects, externally related only by space and time, writes Tim Maudlin, professor of philosophy and physics at NYU. Something deeper and more mysterious knits together the fabric of the world. Indeed, according to Richard Conn Henry, professor of physics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins, to see the universe as it really is, we must abandon our tendency to conceptualize observations as things. Reductionism envisages a universe of things, and simply material things at that. How these things are related is viewed as a secondary matter. However, I suggest that relationships are primary, more foundational than the things related, that the relationships don't just connect pre-existing things, but modify what we mean by the things, which in turn modify everything else they are in relationship with. That is because what we are dealing with are ultimately relations, events, processes. Things is a useful shorthand for those elements congealed in the flow of experience that emerge secondarily from and attract our attention in a primary web of interconnections. I have nothing against things, provided we don't see them as primary. In our ordinary way of thinking, things must be established before there can be relationships, and so this about turn would seem paradoxical. But, as I shall explain, paradox very often represents a conflict between the different takes afforded by the two hemispheres. However, we must also be prepared to find that, as Niels Bohr recognized, whereas trivial truths manifestly exclude their opposites, the most profound truths do not. This is itself a version of the realization that what applies at the local level does not necessarily apply in the same way at the global level. The failure to observe this principle underlies some of the current misconceptions of both science and philosophy. I believe that nowadays we live no longer in the presence of the world, but rather in a representation of it. The significance of that is that the left hemisphere's task is to represent what first presences to the right hemisphere. This representation has all the qualities of a virtual image, an infinitely thin, immobile fragment of a vast, seamless, living, ever-flowing whole. From a standpoint within the representation, as a necessarily diminished derivative of it, we see reality as merely a special case of our representation, one in which something is added in to animate it. In this, it is like a cinefilm that consists of countless static slices, requiring a projector to bring it back into what at least looks to us like a living flow. On the contrary, however, reality is not an animated version of our representation of it, but our representation a devitalized version of reality. It is the representation that is a special, wholly atypical and imaginary case of what is truly present, as the film strip is of life. The representation is simply what one might call the limit case of what is real. Stepping out of this world picture and into the world, stepping out of suspended animation and back into life, will involve inverting many of our perhaps cherished assumptions. The concept of the limit case is one I will recur to. I am using it to mean that what is essential to the phenomenon has, in this case, reached its minimum without being actually extinguished. It should not be taken as typical, but as the very opposite. Thus, reverting to the example of relationships and the things related, relationship is the norm. Isolation, if it could ever be wholly achieved, which it cannot, would be the limit case of interrelation. Or again, to continue the image of the cinefilm, in the Newtonian universe, the natural state of anything is stasis. According to Newtonianism, motion is an aberration from this primal state of perfect inertia, requiring the equivalent of the projector, some energy conceived as added from outside to set it going. However, nothing, we know, is in reality ever entirely static, and relative stasis, not motion, is the unusual circumstance that requires explanation. Stasis is, in other words, the limit case of motion in which it approaches but never completely reaches zero. Motion, then, is not an unusual departure from stasis, but stasis an unachievable imaginary state which in reality can be approached only as an asymptote. Let me give a few further examples, which I grant may seem at first sight surprising, even nonsensical. We could start with your own thought processes and their expression in language. The explicit is not more fully real than the implicit. It is merely the limit case of the implicit, with much of its vital meaning sheared off, narrowed down, and finalized. The literal is not more real than the metaphorical. It is merely the limit case of the metaphorical, in which the wealth of meaning is collapsed into a one-to-one correspondence for a useful temporary purpose. More importantly, it's the wider cosmos whose deep structure we are inclined to misunderstand. It may seem obvious that randomness is the primary condition, and that order is an unusual phenomenon that emerges from how, and is supervenient on that primary chaos. However, order is not a special case of randomness, but randomness merely the limit case of order, which is the universal norm. Indeed, true randomness is a theoretical construct that does not exist. Complexity and simplicity are relative terms. However, complexity is, surely we imagine, a more unusual state of affairs, arising out of the agglomeration of more simple elements, isn't it? I believe that this is a mistake, one all too understandable given our worldview, but a mistake nonetheless. Rather, complexity is the norm, and simplicity represents a special case of complexity achieved by cleaving off and disregarding almost all of the vast reality that surrounds whatever it is we are, for the moment, modelling as simple. Simplicity is a feature of our model, not of the reality that is modelled. In keeping with this, and don't worry, right now this should seem crazy, inanimacy is better regarded as the limit case of animacy, something I will come to later in the book. Potential is not simply all the things that never happened, a ghostly penumbra around the actual. The actual is the limit case of the potential, which is equally real, the one into which it collapses out of the many, as the particle is the collapse of a quantum field. The particle is not more real than the field, rather it is a special case of the field in which its field-like characteristics are at a minimum. Similarly, the wholly determinate, were it to exist, which it does not, would be the limit case of the indeterminate. Straight lines, inasmuch as they can be said to exist at all, do so as the limit case of curves, which constitute all the lines in nature. Even space and the paths travelled in it are curved. Linearity is the limit case of non-linearity, and can be approximated only by taking ever narrower views of an infinitely complex picture. The discontinuous, inasmuch as it can be said to exist at all, is the limit case of the continuous, which is the norm. Total independence is an imaginary construct, the limit case of interdependence, which is universal. And the whole is shot through with purpose. A notion, by the way, that has nothing to do with some sort of engineering God, and endlessly creative, not pointless and passive. This cosmos is one from which we are never separate, but out of which we arise, in which we dwell, and to which finally we return. My ultimate aim is to contribute a new perspective from which to look at the fundamental building blocks, as we think of them, of the cosmos. Time, space, depth, motion, matter, consciousness, uniqueness, beauty, goodness, truth, purpose, and the very idea of the existence or otherwise of a God. These will form the subject of the last part of the book. Of course, these are vast topics, ones that have been grappled with by the ablest human minds for millennia. Naturally, I don't presume to try to settle the disputes that have arisen. Moreover, I am very far from being the first person to argue that the prevailing view is badly mistaken. But I do believe that the hemisphere hypothesis casts a very revealing new light on those disputes, and strongly suggests that the view that has prevailed, a view heavily indebted to a belief in reductionism, very seriously distorts the evidence of the nature of reality that is before our eyes, if only we would attend to it fully. It provides a genuinely new and compelling context in which to revisit these issues, one that may encourage us toward very different conclusions. At the end of the book, I shall return to considering the possible relevance of all this to the crises the world so palpably faces, and to the condition of our own culture in the West. By then, though, I hope the relevance will have become all too obvious to the reader through following the arguments of the book. A brief clarification. Before I go any further, I'm going to offer some indications towards an important aspect of the philosophical position I have come to espouse, and which I will advocate in this book. It is one that has arisen slowly through reflections on experience, And in a way, I would rather have left an expression of it to emerge more slowly and organically out of what I will be going on to discuss. But I think that without some preliminary statement, however brief, the reader might jump to erroneous conclusions which may ultimately make it harder to see the fuller picture when we arrive there. I hope that questions I raise without addressing them immediately here will be found to be addressed in due course. My position will become much clearer as the book unfolds. These are my first words, by no means my last. I wish at this stage to do little more than clearly distance myself from two positions. In the last century or so, there has been a tendency, at least in popular discourse, to pull reality in opposing directions. Some scientists, whether they put it this way or not when they're asked to reflect, still carry on as if there just exists a reality out there, brackets rot, the nature of which is independent of any consciousness of it. Naive realism. These are usually biologists. You won't find many physicists who would think that. In reality, we participate in the knowing. There is no view from nowhere. Of crucial importance is that this fact does not in any way prevent science legitimately speaking of truths. Far from it, a point I will return to in subsequent chapters. We desperately need what science can tell us, and postmodern attempts to undermine it should be vigorously resisted. Two important truths, then. Science cannot tell us everything, but what science can tell us is pure gold. Any attempt to suppress science, I distinguish science sharply from technology, for whatever reason, is dangerous and wrong. Meanwhile, on the other hand, there are philosophers of the humanities who think there is no such thing as reality, since it's all made up miraculously by ourselves, brackets mumbo. Naive idealism. Such people, by the way, never behave as though there was no reality, nor, of course, by its own logic can they claim any truth for their position. These viewpoints are closer than they look. One party fears that if what we call reality were in any sense contaminated by our own involvement in bringing it about, it would no longer be worthy of being called real. The other fears that since we manifestly do play a part in its coming about, it's already the case that it can't be called real. But just because we participate in reality doesn't mean we invent it out of nowhere or solipsistically project it on some inner mental screen. Much less does it mean that the very idea of reality is thereby invalidated. I take it that there is something that is not just the contents of my mind, that, for example, you, my reader, exist. There is an infinitely vast, complex, multifaceted, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves. The only world that any of us can know, then, is what comes into being in the never-ending encounter between us and this whatever it is. What is more, I will claim that both parties evolve and are changed through the encounter. It is how we and it become more fully what we are. The process is both reciprocal and creative. Think of it as like a true and close relationship between two conscious beings. Neither is, of course, made up by the other, but both are, to some extent, perhaps to a great extent, made what they are through their relationship. If this seems at this point a step too far, the reader can, I hope, embrace a weaker position, that at least, as I say, our world is what comes into being in the encounter between us and this whatever it is. The relationship comes before the relata, the things that are supposed to be related. What we mean by the word "and" is not just additive, but creative. There is no one absolute truth about the world that results from this process, but there are certainly truths. Some things we believe will be truer than others. A maximally open, patient, and attentive response to whatever it is better at disclosing or discerning reality than a response that is peremptory, insensitive, or above all, shrouded in dogma. Importantly, what we experience is not just an image of a world outside, some sort of projection on the walls of a Cartesian theatre inside our heads, and watched by an intracerebral homunculus on an intracerebral sofa. As I will explain, such a viewpoint could be predicted to arise from the left hemisphere's attempt to deal with a reality it does not understand and for which everything is a representation. True, we can deceive ourselves by mistaking our own projections for reality, and we often do, but that does not entail that we are always victims of self-deception. When we are properly attentive, what we experience is the real deal, though it be only a tiny part of all that is. To appreciate that, you need the right hemisphere, and preferably, of course, both hemispheres to be in play. It is true that we can see the world only partially, but we still each see the world directly. It is not a representation, but a real presence. There is not a wall between us and the world. Our experience is of whatever it is, and not another thing, even if we can't get away from the fact that it is we who experience it. Yet I say we take part in its creation. How can that be? An analogy may help get closer to what I mean.